Hi, this is Valley View with your host Ken Adams, and this week I'm joined by City Councilman Tom Andersen from Ward 2. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thanks a lot, Ken. It's great to be here.
We have a lot of situations going on at City Council, and sometimes people have heard about it and sometimes not, but the Urban Tree Commission proposal I thought was very interesting and needed, I guess.
Oh, I agree.
And so maybe you could give us a little bit of background about why the proposal came up and what it hopes to do, and,
Sure.
and what it looks like what will happen to it.
Well, you know, I think, Ken, that this is one of the things in the city that people have heard about because there has been some controversy about various trees that were taken down in the city, by the city, on city property, starting, I don't know, 2011, 2012, with the trees that were on State Street and Commercial, kind of around the United States Bank there, the U.S. Bank there. And they were taken down through the mechanism that was there at the time at the city. And there was really no opportunity to comment. There was no opportunity, there was not much notice. It was the way the city statutes were at that time were sort of vague as to what happens. And there was something called the Shade Tree Advisory Committee that was in place with the city statutes, but they were just that. They were an advisory committee, and they recommended that the trees not be taken down, but that's all it was a recommendation.
I think they actually recommended that they be trimmed.
Right, right. Well, and that's part of, we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit here, but that's what the ordinance looks at, steps one should take before taking them down. And you're exactly right. The Shade Tree Committee said, Advisory Committee said, we think that these can be handled by pruning, by something less final than chopping a tree down.
Right.
And that advice was not followed for whatever reasons by the Director of Public Works, who makes the decisions under the statute. So that caused quite an uproar. And then just recently, there were trees on High Street in front of Da Vinci's restaurant that were taken down. And a third thing that in the public's mind might be connected but isn't really is the trees and that were taken down at the former School for the Blind property.
Howard Hall.
Yes. The difference there, Ken, is that those are trees on private property. They're governed by different statutes and different ordinances than the city trees are. So the trees that were taken down downtown are in fact trees that are on city-owned properties, so they're owned by you and me and every other citizen of the city of Salem. So that's part of the difference. Now, this shade tree ordinance had been in effect for a long time, and there was also sort of some individualized concern about what happens, say, to a tree on your block that might be taken down. And I know that happened to me. We had 3 magnificent elms in front of our house. We just live, well, I live in Ward 2, where I represent, around Bush's Pasture Park. And the city Public Works Department showed up there one day, ready to take the trees down. And you know, after talking with them, it was an appropriate thing to do, but it's still quite a shock for not only my wife and me, but for our neighbors, for anybody driving down the street. And that happens a lot, especially in the core area neighborhoods where, you know, tree coverage and shade is one of the amenities that people like to live in an older area of town for.
And those trees have been up for maybe 100 years.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, we had these elm trees that were, you know, 80 feet tall, and were replaced by other elm trees that are Dutch elm resistant, but you know, they're 8 feet tall, and so they're not going to grow as much as that.
You won't see them full grown.
No. It'll be a miracle of medicine if I do.
Yes.
But so this is kind of the background that there was for, you know, I want to say these 3 things. The Howard Hall, which is not at all related to the statute, has nothing to do, but in the public mind, they say, geez, trees are going down all over the city. Then there was what happened at the 2 areas downtown, and then there's the general long-term theme of what happens in neighborhood. So some time ago, it was Councilor Bennett, Ward 1, another close-in council. This was actually before my time on the city council. Moved to have an advisory committee set up to look at the ordinance. And they worked very hard for a very long time. And it was people from the neighborhoods, it was people who had interest in trees, both personally and professionally. And it was people on the Parks Board. So it was a pretty wide panoply of people who could be there. And they came up with an ordinance that was proposed. And at the last city council meeting, I think it was probably unanimous, we move forward with the proposed ordinance to the extent that we want to do a public education process, time for public comment. So in the next few months, we'll be the Public Works Department and its people in the department will be going to the neighborhood groups. There are going to be other groups. I suspect like they might go to Downtown Rotary or something like that, with a discussion of the proposed ordinance. And then I know they'll have a great PowerPoint presentation because they do that. Our city does a good job at that. And then they'll solicit input from the neighborhood groups and the other groups. There will also be, the proposed ordinance is already on the city website now, and I'm sure in the process of obtaining public comment, we'll make it a headliner on the website rather than something you have to
kind of buried.
Yeah. We were on the radio today, and I was explaining how I got it, and it's, was go here, go here, go here. And so it won't be a convoluted process, so it'll be right there. Then we'll have a public hearing, time for anybody who wants to come down and talk. Then we'll have a time for public comment, and I'll tell you, we've received, I don't know, several dozen emails on this issue. And tangentially, I have to say that I have yet to see an email that says we don't want trees and we don't want an urban tree commission, which is one of the proposals in the ordinance, proposed ordinance, is to establish not the Shade Tree Advisory Committee, but actually an urban tree commission. And that's clearly not set in stone, or should I say set in bark, but that's one that's there, and that'll again be subject to public input and public comment, and then council deliberation.
And the commission would be more of the final word on this. It wouldn't just be one individual, and that I think would be a big help.
I think part of my understanding is that's the difference between an advisory committee and a commission.
Right.
Words.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
people understood that this would be more of a final decision maker rather than an advisory, which it was before.
As the ordinance, proposed ordinance stands right now, and I actually brought it down with me here, Ken, and this is what it looks like, folks. So it's 10 or 12. I don't have my reading glasses on, but I think that says 18 on the bottom there.
15.
15, okay. So it's not as bad as 18, it's 15 pages. So the process will be if someone wishes a tree to be taken down on city property, and that could be any adjacent property owner. So it could be a business downtown, it could be you or I in front of our house, or it could be anybody with a tree on city property. There's a very detailed, very set out process that we can talk about in a minute that has to be gone through, and then a decision is made by the Public Works Director with, of course, input from their people on the staff. We have an urban forester, we have other people who are in charge of kind of this program, and they'll look at it and look at the criteria and make a recommendation. Then the Public Works Director will make a decision, but that's not the final decision. In the old ordinance, that was the final decision. Now, I have to, with the caveat here, we're talking about the proposed ordinance. And so
it can change.
Yeah, and but the way the proposed ordinance says is if an interested party wants to appeal the director's decision, then they have a time limit which is much broader or longer than the old time limit used to be. I think it's 15 business days, which is in effect 3 weeks. They appeal that, then it gets to the Urban Tree Commission who makes a decision, and the Urban Tree Commission's decision is final. No appeal to a hearings officer, no appeal to the City Council, that's it. Now, there are a couple other potentials for the ordinance. One would be, instead of an appeal to an Urban Tree Commission, it would be an appeal to a hearings officer. So the decision would be made at the director level, and then appeal to that would be a hearings officer. Another one would be just to get rid of, not have an Urban Tree Commission and just have the director make the decision, which is the way it was before. And so I don't think there's much to say about the director decision, except to say that trees are so important to Salem. We're a tree city. We have been for 40 years. Yeah. We've got this plaque up there, or actually it's a banner in City Hall. So, you know, it seems to me that the better course might be to have someone other than an administrator make the decision, have more people who in Salem who were concerned about in on the decision-making process. I'm
sure he would probably appreciate not being on the hot seat on some of these.
I think you're exactly right, and I'll have to tell you, in some of the discussions we've had in council, in the open council session, I have said, I am reading between the lines of what is proposed. It's pretty clear to me that the director would just assume not be the one to make the final decision. Right. And I said something like, let the record reflect that the director is nodding his head.
Yes. And one of the things, too, is that, like where I live on Chemeketa, and there's some huge trees on Chemeketa. And when you take those down, it's going to change the environment.
Oh,
I mean, it's not just the aesthetics.
No.
You know, because near where I live, there's 2 evergreen trees that are 80 to 100 feet tall.
Yeah.
And so, like, the shading and everything else is going to be affected. So people feel really attached to those trees. It changes the environment. It changes the look. And so it is very important. And downtown is much more inviting, I think, with trees.
I agree. I agree.
And I know that my son came to visit shortly after we moved here. Yeah. And he liked it because it reminded him of New England, where he had visited a few times, and he really enjoyed that kind of aspect.
I tell you, Ken, I grew up in a Chicago suburb that was full of elm trees, you know, arching over the street, so that the branches on one side would touch the branches on the other, and it was just beautiful. And then Dutch elm disease came in, and I came back, you know, 15 years after I left home, and it was just devastating to me to see there were trees there, but again, they were 8 feet high because they had just been wiped out. Another thing along the same lines you're talking about, how people have an emotional attachment to trees and what they provide on environmental, aesthetic, property values. You can probably list 4 or 5 other reasons. And there's just been something in Portland, in one of the Portland areas, a developer bought a big piece of property that had some huge cedars on it. And I mean huge, like you and I could not span it if we tried to hug it.
Yeah.
And neighbors banded together and are buying the property just to save the trees. Buying it from the developer who was within his rights to cut them down and put up houses. So, you know, I don't know that Salem would go to that extent, but that's a real example of the way people feel about trees.
And, you know, that's not everybody, but there's a large group of people that feel very strongly about trees. And you know, like in this time that we're talking about climate change, maintaining the trees that we have, I think, should be kind of more of a priority than what I've seen.
No, I agree. I agree. It you know, exchanges, takes out carbon dioxide, puts out oxygen, if I'm remembering my,
your
middle
basic
school science.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing, I want to get back a bit to the tree commission itself, because, you know, I was saying how this would be citizen, and that is true, but of the 7 members of the Tree Commission as proposed, there would be a representative from either the downtown district or a historic district. There would be somebody from the Parks Commission, and there would be someone who has professional experience in as an
Maintaining
arborist
trees,
or
yeah.
a tree person. I know there's another word.
Arborist is a good
yeah.
term.
Yeah, yeah. And so and there would be members from the public at large. So this 7-member commission would have a lot of expertise, and I would also guess that anybody from the public at large is either going to have expertise or a strong interest in the issue.
Right. And we have other commissions, like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Planning Commission and,
Yes.
and so on, and where it is staffed by citizens from the neighborhood, but from various areas. So,
Yeah.
because like when you have a group of people with different, diverse experience, I think you come to a better decision.
Well, you know, we already had the council meeting we had where we moved to continue the process. People came and spoke at the beginning of the meeting. Anybody can do that. At the beginning of every city council meeting, there's a period for anyone who wants to come to comment on any item in the agenda, except those items that are already going to have a hearing, and then you have to wait then. And so people come all the time, and I urge our listeners, our watchers, I guess, to come down anytime they see an item on the agenda that they want to talk about. And at the end of the meeting, which we sometimes move up depending on what the meeting is, there's a time for anybody to comment on anything they want to comment on, nothing that has to do with what's on that agenda. But the point is, I'm finally getting to the point.
Okay.
The point is that someone showed up, and it was actually someone who had something to do with the state forestry. And she said, you know, she cited psychological studies and other sort of studies that show that a group will oftentimes come up, this is not designing something by committee, but a group who's dealing with one issue with diverse points of view will often come up with the best of all possible solutions, because there's a broad base that helps you reach up to the top to the decision. So I think that's what would happen here with the Urban Tree Commission.
Because you're taking more points of view into consideration. Because there's a lot of times, you know, when I worked in corporate America, you get this kind of group think going on.
You worked in corporate America?
Yes, I did. But the thing is you would get this kind of group think, and you would be blind to certain things. And you know, I quite often was the person saying, well, what about this situation? And that was kind of my value in a lot of those settings, is because I would bring up things that weren't being discussed or weren't being considered. And that's one of the advantages, you know, of having a democracy, is you get input from everybody.
The more points of view, the better, because that helps who's ever the decision maker. The process helps them arrive at don't want to say a more correct, but a decision that takes everything into account, which is why I'm telling you people out there, come down and talk to the council. We want to hear you.
And if people don't understand why certain decisions were made, you can always contact your council member. And it's important to know those things. Who is your council member, and talking to them about situations, because sometimes you're not aware of all that goes into making these kinds of decisions.
I agree 100%, Ken, and I will tell you that I get emails all the time. You go on the city website, you'll see my picture there and my email. You'll see all the other councilors' pictures there and their emails, and they get emails too. And it's very helpful to us to get a gauge of public opinion. That's not to say we're going to follow what the emails say, because we're elected in part because through the election process, people come to trust our judgment. So I'm going to make an independent decision and not necessarily do what you or maybe even the majority want me to do, but that's very helpful in helping me
because you're trying to decide what's best for the entire city.
Exactly right.
Okay,
exactly
and so like your personal little part of the city might be affected more heavily, but it's better for the entire city.
That's right, and that's why I emphasized in the beginning of this that these trees are owned by you, they're owned by me, they're owned by everyone who lives in the city of Salem, and we all have an interest in that.
You know, one of the things, you know, about these street trees, and I'm talking about in more residential areas, and now like I live on Chemeketa, and I know that like that section between the curb and the sidewalk, now those all city? Because in some places it's like 3-4 feet wide, in other places it's just like a couple of feet maybe.
Well, I think we can assume that it's all city, and that there's kind of a little segue here, because as you know and as others know, the city is now has been for a year or two now, embarking on a sidewalk repair, and much of the repair is needed because of the trees.
Right.
And just sort of as an aside, all of you folks out there, once the city comes through and repairs your sidewalk, it's going to be your responsibility.
Right.
Unless you can prove that the city itself caused the problem in the future. So this is another good thing of the ordinance, because the trees that are there and that maybe have to be replaced, if, for example, you cannot trim the roots, you cannot prune the tree, you cannot do something, and you have to take it down, or it has to be taken down, there's a list of replacement trees that actually work in whatever the city urban environment would be, which includes being in the park.
Because there are some trees, the root system is going to always cause a problem.
Yes,
so,
sweet gums.
Yes, which are beautiful trees.
Yes,
but
yeah, sweet gums are great out in the middle of a field or in a backyard. They're not so good between a sidewalk and a street.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed in my neighborhood, I'll look down at the sidewalk and it'll give 1910 or in Ward.
Yeah.
And so somebody built that sidewalk over 100 years ago. And some places, they're still in really good condition, but I've noticed that's where there aren't a whole lot of big trees. There's smaller trees.
Well, and this is just another little telling example of how the city and its staff are actually very careful and very involved and very concerned about trees. In my neighborhood, just south of Bush's Pasture Park, we have been getting the sidewalk replacements, and there are a number of spots in my neighborhood, and the sidewalk, instead of going straight down like this all the way, it goes straight down like this, and then it curves around a tree. Because one of the things that we've learned in the time since these sidewalks were built is you need to really provide sort of a safety zone around the trees themselves. And if the sidewalks get too close to it in the concrete, that is not good for the health of the tree. So there are a lot of little niches cut out so the tree that's there can continue to be a viable tree.
Well, that's I think part of the process that people aren't always aware of.
That's exactly right. And one of the things I talked about in my campaign, and I know it's one of the things that the other councils are concerned about, is transparency in city government and making the government and the governmental process as open as we can to everyone. And this is just another example of that, because it's going to lay out the criteria. It gives a lot more notice provisions when a tree has been taken down now. There will be the neighborhood group, the property owners will be notified right away, and there will be a sign on the tree, and this is way too much minutia for a policy setting city council to get into, but we were discussing how big the sign should be. Should it be on the street side of the tree? Should it be on the sidewalk side of the tree? And I was also talking about the appeal. Well, the appeal, you have to have, the legal term for it is standing. You have to have enough of an interest in it to be able to appeal, and the statute itself will say that neighborhood groups, property owners, I'm not sure about adjacent properties, I'm not sure that that's in there, but also anyone who provided either written or oral comments in the process. So if you write a letter, Ken, and the decision is made that you don't agree with, you have standing to appeal. So that's another reason why people should get involved in these kind of decisions, because if you are involved, then you can follow it all the way through. And if you just are upset about it after the decision is made, unless you're the neighborhood group or the property owner adjacent to it, or unless you've made a comment, you're done. You don't have any way to appeal the decision.
And you know, a lot of times people think of government as something else outside them, but we are the government.
Oh man, and you're telling me, you know, this is democracy at the lowest level, and you know, what the city council, no matter what their views on things are or how they were elected, I think we're all here because we want to make Salem a better city. And we all have different views, but that gets back to your thing about the group decision often is the best. So we'll be spending a lot of time on this issue.
And so people need to go and educate themselves about what is exactly in the proposal. And when the meeting is announced for public comment, they should come down to City Council.
Yep.
Also, if they're interested, they can go to their neighborhood association because
Yep.
it'll be on their agenda
Yeah.
at some point.
And I know that as this process gets rolling, you know, there'll be notices sent out in every possible way. It'll be on the website. It'll go to the neighborhood groups involved. It will go, as I said, I just said, you know, the Rotary clubs. It'll go to other public organizations. I'm sure it'll go to the chamber. It'll go to all sorts of organizations that are in this city, because the more comments we have, the more broad-based they are, the better the resultant ordinance is going to be, no matter what it says.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, and I didn't want to start another topic, but I thought maybe...
I have a little bit more on the tree ordinance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What it really does is it sets out criteria in the ordinance. And it is clear that everything should be done possible before the decision is made to cut the tree. And they have definitions of what trees are. They talk about heritage trees. They also talk about the potential for variances. It talks about what happens in emergency situations. So it's really detailed and laid out, which is important. So, as I said, there were 15 pages of the ordinance. So
Right.
A lot of it is, I don't know how you would put it. I guess I'd just say legal boilerplate as a lawyer about here's what the process is. But there's a lot of things that is not procedure, that are not procedural, but are substantive in nature. And those are very important, and people need to look at it and be able to comment on it.
Yeah, and one of the things, too, I think that sometimes isn't always well known is, like you were talking about the Dutch elm disease. And if a tree has something like that, some sort of disease, it is important to get it down quickly so it doesn't spread.
Yeah.
And that is one of the criteria that we're talking about, too.
Yes, exactly, and that's in the statute. And an example that we can give on other trees being taken down is there's a bunch of walnut trees along Center Street at by the state hospital, and a lot of people were upset, rightfully so, that a lot of them have been taken down in the past few months. But the reason they have is they are diseased, and once those walnuts get diseased, once one tree does, if you don't take it down right away, pretty soon the tree next to it, or squirrels or a tree 4 down from it, something's going to happen. So there are some cases, you know, even though you think of trees, you know, like ants, very slow moving, very ponderous, you know, so they don't make the, you know, decisions don't need to be made quickly. But in that situation, they do.
They do, yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I lived in Sacramento when they did have Dutch elm disease, and there were a number of large trees that had to come down as a result.
Yeah.
And it's really sad, but it is important so it doesn't spread.
Yeah. And, you know, we're trying to sustain this city, not just for you and me, Ken, but for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. So the unfortunate fact that a tree has to go now, in the long run, we're going to actually have a sustainable situation for generations to come, because a new tree is planted that will last for, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of years.
And that's what we need.
Yes, we do.
Okay. And Tom, I want to thank you for coming in and joining us in the conversation. We're going to continue a conversation next time. And this has been the Valley View.
Thank you.